It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, dig into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is my friend Billy Hallowell, and we're going to be discussing his brand new film, Investigating the Supernatural Miracles. Billy, it's always a joy to see you, my friend. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's been too long. I'm excited to be here.
Well, truly my pleasure. Somehow we totally missed each other at NRB, so I'm glad we could connect here a few weeks later over Zoom rather than saying hi in person.
Yeah, it's so funny. We're in the same venue, but it's such a crazy venue, and there was so much going on, and you were on my list of people to connect with, and somehow we missed each other. It's kind of wild.
Well, we'll see each other in Nashville next year. It's all good. I think, Billy, the place I'd love to start is just hearing about your journalism journey. Like the whole time I've worked with you through the years, I've known you as a journalist working for different news organizations, kind of different Christian venues. But I'd never actually heard kind of your early days and how you got started. And so I'd love to hear about what that looked like for how you started out. And then, looking back, did you ever think you'd be making a film?
Oh my gosh. This project, Investigating the Supernatural Miracles, this documentary is the first time, even in the last 2 weeks, that I've actually paused to really ponder over the amazing ways that God has just weaved things together in my life. I mean, I shouldn't say the first time ever, but really I've spent the most time thinking about these things because, to answer your latter question, I had a dream of making a documentary or hosting a documentary. I just didn't really think it was something that would probably happen because of the budget and how much effort it takes. And just, so I'm a big believer in letting God lead us where we're supposed to go. And so here we are talking about this. It did happen. But when I go back to the early sort of years, one of the things that God did very early in my life was open a door to media when I was only 15 years old. And, I think about a lot of young people today, and I think, gosh, we need to cultivate experiences like that when God's calling young people to something, instead of dismissing them or pushing them off to the side. We need to, once we know that it's a calling from God, really help usher them into it, because I did have people around me who were very helpful and did help guide me. After the Columbine shooting, I really found myself as a 15-year-old freshman in high school, very affected by what had happened, feeling like I wanted to do something. I lived in New York. I didn't live in Colorado. I was nowhere near it. But I created this website, and it's so funny. Teen Web Online was the name of it, back when websites were barely a thing, and created the website as sort of a resource for other teenagers to try to prevent events like that from happening. That experience, I wanted to create a TV show. So when you asked the question about a documentary, as a 15-year-old being very naive, I thought we can create a TV show. It'll be so easy. And so I met with producers. I mean, I made it pretty far meeting with people, but we couldn't raise the money to do that. And I didn't really know how to do that. But that experience led me, by the time I was 18, to have a column. I was writing, I was traveling, I was speaking. So that little project developed into a very big thing for me. And I went to college for journalism, and the rest is sort of history. It was kind of like a snowball that started really young. So I'm 41 now. I've been doing this since I was 15, which is just the majority of my life, which is kind of crazy.
And next, Billy, I'd love to hear, what was the genesis or for the idea for the film? How did that come about? Did you hear a story? Did you see a need? Where did this idea for a series of films looking at the supernatural get its start?
Yeah, this too, because we've talked many times over the years. I've had a lot of different topics that God has sort of laid on my heart, and I've tried to avoid doing them maybe at moments and try to push that off and not listen. And yet eventually I've come around and done them. And what I mean by that is, one of the first books I wrote was on the end times and sort of unpacking that and helping. It was called Armageddon Code, helping Christians understand what the Bible says about the end times. Then I worked on a book called Playing with Fire back in 2020 that dealt with evil and the demonic realm. So I've had sort of a history in some of the more difficult topics, and the more debated topics, and the more sort of big topics within controversial, I guess, topics within the church over time. And miracles has always been something that I've been captivated by. I've told a lot of stories over the years, and a lot of them have been miracle stories. And also when the miracle doesn't happen, how do we navigate that? So I was actually pitching an idea to CBN, which came out of nowhere. I didn't intend to pitch this idea, but about doing something on Playing with Fire, on the demonic realm, And what we ended up settling on was, hey, what if we did a 3-part TV series on the supernatural? And we looked at miracles and angels and demons and heaven and hell. And I mean, it happened very quickly. CBN greenlit this idea, and it came from director Jared Anderson, who's Emmy nominated, brilliant director. He's on staff with CBN, and Jared sort of drove that project. And once we got in the field to start filming and we got on set and we started talking to people, we realized that the miracles portion of this was not, it couldn't be told in 30 minutes. It was not a TV series, that it was a documentary, and that maybe we had a documentary series on our hands. And so we immediately shifted how we were approaching investigating the supernatural and walked away with this film, Investigating the Supernatural Miracles.
And I'm curious, on a personal kind of faith level, what it was like to kind of go down this rabbit hole for you. Because for me, having worked with NDEs for the last 7, 8 years and being part of charismatic publishing for 11 years, a lot of the people I see in the film I'm familiar with. And this is, miracles and crazy encounters. Like that's kind of part and parcel for my world. Was some of this new to you? Had you encountered, like, what was it like for you? Because at least in my impression, you come from a more conservative background than where I've worked for the past decade.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I think for me, I've never been in the camp of miracles aren't real. I've always believed that they happen still. I think there's a big debate in the church today about whether miracles have ceased. I have never embraced that idea, but at the same time, I haven't been around the big bombastic miracles that we investigate in this film. So personally had not been around them, but believed it, thought it could happen. So coming into this, it really was faith shaking in a very positive way, because once you're confronted with some of that, you have to start thinking through the way you live your faith out. You have to start thinking through the way you handle not only the possibility of miracles, but the possibility of a miracle not happening, of a situation not going the way that we want it to, of maybe not understanding the mystery of why somebody isn't healed. And so dealing with those things and coming into investigating them had a really, honestly, a profound effect on me. And at the same time, dealing with some medical things with one of my daughters. And I was telling my family last night, actually, I was like, I hadn't really thought about how God had set me sort of on this journey with this film. And at the same time, my daughter was going through something and we were seeing miracles happen. And I wasn't registering that these things were happening in a parallel sense. And so even with that, it's gotten me thinking much different about how I need to approach my quest for miracles in my own life.
I'm curious in terms of people that you interviewed, had in the film, like practically, creatively, like how did you source your guests? Like what did it look like to this? Because again, you start going down this rabbit hole. There's hundreds and hundreds of people you could potentially talk to, and you had an intriguing range. So how did that kind of come to light for you?
Yeah, this was a different experience in some ways, because by the time we got to set to film, we knew the stories that we wanted. We knew what we needed. We spent a lot of time, especially Jared, the director, digging into these stories, betting, throwing stories out that didn't make sense to do. We wanted to have the bar needed to be up here. What I mean by that is there are lots of miracles that are amazing, and they're definitely miracles, but they can't really be, and I'm going to say the word proven, because you can never 100% prove a miracle, but you can get pretty close to proving that something inexplicable has happened, right? We wanted that bar to be very high. So we would go through testimony after testimony after story. And you are obviously very familiar with some of these stories. Most people aren't going to be. Maybe they've heard them in random places, but we really felt strongly that we needed to have the most compelling cases possible. And so we knew going in that, hey, these are deeply compelling and we're going to try to poke holes in them, because even though I'm a Christian, investigating, sort of going in, I went in with a little bit of skepticism in order to sort of say, hey, I want to put the pedal to the metal on this and prove that maybe something did happen here. But if it didn't, we want to be able to highlight that. But I had a pretty good idea going in that we were dealing with some pretty incredible content.
And you had an interesting mix of like doctors, you had some apologists, Bible scholars, and then you show people who've experienced miracles as well. In terms of like two people that are going to be very familiar, Lee Strobel, Craig Keener, I saw various times throughout the film. Talk to us a little bit about why it was important to bring in those kinds of voices, in addition to the experiencers of the miracles and the kind of the doctors, scientists angle.
Yeah, I think, really you wanted to hit every part of this. If you're going to truly investigate something, if you're going to truly look into something like this, you want to be able to say, okay, I've gone to the theologians, I've gone to the people who have thought deeply about this from a faith perspective, I've gone to the people who have gone through it, I've gone to the scientists and the doctors and the people who have actually seen these things and will back them, and understand that maybe something was going on there, and of course reenactments too, being able to, we didn't just want to tell people the story, which I do think there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. 90% of the films and the TV shows that deal with miracles are telling a story. We wanted to show people what happened too. And that requires a different level of content. It requires you need to sort of have a multifaceted approach to bring it all together. And I think that's what we were able to do with this. And, the goal is to get people thinking, because at the end of the day, you have the Christians like you and I who believe in miracles. We believe it's possible. We know it still happens today. You have Christians who have sort of bought into this. I would say it's hyper secular, or it's at least a version of understanding of Scripture that would say miracles cease, they no longer happen, or maybe they're not sure. That camp, I think, is deeply challenged by a film like this, because you have to, and same with the atheists and the skeptics, you have to look at it and say, okay, this person had a brain tumor. They got no medical treatment whatsoever, no surgeries, and that brain tumor is gone and there's only scar tissue left. What happened that led to that? You have to be able to answer that question. And those other two groups, they're not able to answer that question. And so they're left throwing their hands up in the air. But my hope is that it gets them thinking a little bit deeper about some of this.
Yeah, and I think when you're looking at kind of supernatural experiences, there's always that challenge where you either got to go for natural reasoning or solutions behind it, or supernatural or paranormal, even, which comes up sometimes in these conversations. But it's one or the other. Like there's no other ground to play in. I'm curious in terms of, I guess let me jump to Heidi Baker. I was a little bit surprised to see Heidi pop up in the film. Obviously, the researchers you talked to, they went to Mozambique and followed Heidi around and like were testing people to see if they could hear and whatnot. Um, you know, Heidi's a bit extreme compared to, I just started going to all these prayer meetings and church events in different states and drove 5,000 miles, which is what one of the guys who got healed talks about. But what do you think about how Heidi does what she does? It's just it's a little out of the box, but she goes in and declares healing, and God's going to show up, and it's a whole thing with her ministry, and people do get healed. Like, was that a challenge for you? Did that feel normal? Like, how'd you deal with that personally?
Yeah, I think, look, you're going to have people who there's debate around them in this space, right? And you're going to have even the subjects we had, right? There are people who are going to debate and discuss how they approach their own understanding of their miracles. I think with Heidi, what the reason she was included in what was, because we didn't talk with her, we didn't interview her, but what we did was we showed this experiment, and the reason it was compelling was because Josh Brown, Dr. Joshua Brown and Candy Brown, they went out and they actually did an investigation, a scientific investigation of these healings. And that was the part that made it compelling, where that you literally had a scenario where people's sight was coming back and it was documented. So that was why that piece was included. And I think people, because I've gotten that feedback. Some people loved that. Some people said, oh, that was an interesting choice. The choice being made because of that study. There are not a lot of people, especially in the medical and scientific world, who are very deeply interested in studying the interactions between people and God and people in prayer and healings. And so there have been some studies, but not really well done. That was a very interesting one that we actually felt was important to show, especially in light of the fact that Dr. Joshua Brown, who had the brain tumor that disappeared, who is a neuroscientist, that he is actually a big subject in this film.
Yeah, and even with that kind of a style, I mean, in my world, that's very kind of classic Vineyard or Catch the Fire, where or like a Randy Clark Global Awakening event. They're going to go after healing. They're going to go after God showing up to raise the faith in the room to get even more healing to occur. So again, in my world, that's very normalized, but in like the broader evangelical world, it's very uncomfortable if you've never seen that before.
It is, and I think if there wasn't a study, it would have. If there weren't these interesting bits of research, and people will see this in the film that came out of that, it probably would have felt a little stranger to some people. But I think they'll appreciate that, regardless of what people think about certain individuals and the work that they're doing or how they're doing it, and some will love it and some won't. that when you have a documented sort of improvement in people, you have to scratch your head and say, well, what is going on here? Josh and Candy are doing good work. They're not making this up. It's data that they're witnessing firsthand. And so that helps sort of add to the narrative that maybe something bigger is going on in these cases.
Yeah, it was definitely a good addition to the film. I think next I'd love to go to Chauncey Crandall. I've met him in passing at some media events in the past. He's an interesting one in the sense that his son dies, even though they were praying for healing, and this sends him down this whole path of, as a doctor, going after and praying for healing in his patients. You had talked about, you've been on this parallel journey of making this film, going through health things with your daughter and praying there. I've in the past 3 years went on this whole cancer journey with my wife who passed away. Praying for healing in my professional and ministry context. I see people healed quite regularly, but not even necessarily not getting to see that healing with my wife. And so there's those weird tensions where we see things in ministry, but it doesn't always play out the same in our personal life. And so I was glad you bring Chauncey on, because this is one of the challenges I see in my charismatic world is, if we don't see the healing we want to pick up our ball and go home like we've failed. Yet, sometimes it is, in my opinion, it's time for somebody to go home to heaven. And that is a good answer to prayer. That person is healed on the other side of the veil. I mean, that's why I work in the NDE space, just to give encouragement that heaven's a real option and people are healed there. But talk to me a little bit about Chauncey. Like, was he a bit challenging for you? Like you cover him a lot in the film. So why'd you give him so much airtime?
Yeah, Dr. Chauncey Crandall is one of the most interesting people I've probably ever interacted with because of the narrative and the story surrounding him. And you mentioned some of it. When you have a doctor, a medical doctor who's well respected, who is a believer, who has a son, who, by the way, he and his wife, they desperately wanted to have children. It was a miracle that they got these twins, that they got pregnant with twins. And then to have one of those twins suffer from leukemia and be given such a short time to live, and then to live 4 years as they're on this journey looking for healing for their son, to then lose their son, and then to be forced into this position, which I think a lot of people, you with your wife, it's the same thing. You have a choice to make. Am I going to be angry at God and blame God that I didn't get this miracle and that this horrible thing happened? Or am I going to lean in and trust God more than ever? And I think what we see with Chauncey Crandall is he leans in to trust God more than ever, and now is seeing all sorts of healings in his ministry. And when I say ministry, obviously he's in ministry, but also in his medical office, praying for patients, watching, according to him, tumors disappear, seeing all these amazing healings. It's pretty interesting that somebody who didn't get the miracle is seeing others get it and is driven to keep seeking God in that process. So that it was challenging for me in that it made me think deeper about a lot of the things we don't want to think about, the things that you have had to think about, you and your children, with with your wife and her death, and all of that. In really specifically thinking, how would I handle this situation? Would I fight for the miracle until the end while also knowing and trusting that the healing might be on the other side? And I've said this in interviews, and I'll say it again this week. I mean, I think going into this project, I probably would have been the type of person who would have prayed lightly and gently for the healing, and I would have given up at some point and just sort of allowed whatever was going to happen if it were me. Whereas now I would hold the same trust level of God, that he might not heal me on this side, but that I would fight till the very end, just like Crandall and the others did. Because guess what? Crandall didn't get the miracle. Some of the other people in the documentary did. And so it just changed the way I look at trust versus the want for a miracle.
I don't remember if it was Lee Strobel or Craig Keener. Somebody in the film talks about, some people can have an attitude that people who believe in the supernatural, they're just not very sharp, or they're not very smart, or easily fooled. I'm curious, in terms of audience who have seen the film already, how are people responding? Like, again, my charismatic world is going to think this is the best film ever, and they're going to feel very at home. Some of my hyper conservative friends on the more evangelical side, this film could be a challenge for them because they struggle with, are these gifts happening today? What's been the range of audience responses so far?
Yeah, it's been really interesting, even, in talking with a Calvinist in particular who watched it and actually really liked it. I'm hearing very positive things, even from people who might struggle with the belief that miracles still happen, or how they think they happen. Because the reality is, these people, I mean, these people, they're not lying about what they've experienced. We have medical documentation. So a thinking person, has to say, well, what's going on? And you can jump through every hoop you can to try to make it make sense. But these cases really don't make much sense from what we know medically, from what we know, even spiritually. So it's pretty incredible. But yeah, we've gotten really good response from people across the board who I think it's sparking different thoughts in people. That's how I would word it. It's making people question what they know, think a little differently, maybe, and maybe they don't abandon their theological position, but they may be a little more gentle in how they approach it. And I think that for me is one of the goals, that we can actually open up this conversation and dig into it, because I don't know, and this is me speaking personally, how people can look at the Bible and read the pages of the Bible every day, some of them, and watch all of these miracles and then believe that there's nothing left miracle wise to happen today. That's a struggle for me. And it's become a bigger one since working on this project.
Yeah, and I can say based on my own journey, like I grew up very conservative, and in God's sense of humor, I became a senior publicist over a charismatic brand 10 years ago, and I had to go to all the conferences where people are praying for healing and people are saying they've been healed and their lives are transformed. And once I was thrown inside the fishbowl, I was like, okay, I have to take it seriously, and I really judged it by the fruit. Like I was seeing people actually healed, seeing marriages transformed, people healed of addiction, and I couldn't overlook the fruit. And that's how God slowly built a bigger comfort level in my life. And so I feel like if we're willing to go to places where we see this stuff happening, God will give us a bigger vision for what's possible. But again, for so many of us that came up who are in our 40s and 50s right now, anything that was even remotely supernatural, it was like, well, that is just bad. Stay away from it. So I feel like with how some of us were raised in the church, we were conditioned against this stuff. Yet I feel like you just said with your Calvinist friend, a lot of us, God's opening our eyes a bit to be like, oh, this actually is a real thing where God's actually moving in this way. But it's a little scary at first because, again, we've been told run away, run fast.
Well, yeah, it is. And I think, I think there has to be a recognition too that we're living in a time when everything is so temporal and in front of, it's all about what we can see and feel and touch. And that we want to be careful not to overemphasize these things, but at the same time, we want to be careful not to let the secular culture and that obsession with the material invade our theology, right? To the point where we're not open to what God might be doing. That seems dangerous, honestly.
And Billy, you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but in terms of your own journey, like how has working on this project changed you? Like I can say on the other side of the journey with my wife, my belief in heaven is off the charts. My want to pray for people and encourage them when they're facing end of life issues is off the charts, versus some people get into a very dark place. I see God as bigger and brighter in my world. For you on the other side of this first film, like how has God shifted and shaped you?
Yeah, I think it's really got me thinking differently about my level of trust in God, and maybe how weak I've been at moments in terms of my willingness to embrace what God is doing and to be open to it. And so it's left me much more open to everything we see in scripture being possible today. And even if I had said before that I believe that in my mind, I don't know that I believed it in my heart the way that I should have. And I'm looking right now, even at my daughter and her scoliosis journey and the miracles we've seen there. And the fact that 3.5 years ago, she went from a 34-degree curve and pretty severe at 6 years old at that time to now, she went into a brace 21 hours a day, full torso brace, and just some difficult things that we were dealing with to have her out of a brace, barely detecting scoliosis right now is pretty eye opening. And even though we went the medical route and we had doctors helping, she has exceeded what was possible. And I believe 100% it was a miracle. So, seeing that, whereas before I might have said the doctors did an amazing job, while believing that prayer was powerful, I'm seeing more of the power of prayer now than I probably ever have in my life.
And for the viewers on the other side of watching this first film, what do you what do you hope shifts? How do you hope you've challenged them? Because just like a book, I always want when somebody finishes that book, I want their faith journey impacted in a meaningful way. So what's that takeaway, that thread you hope every viewer captures?
Yeah, the thread is really the hope that people are challenged to think deeper about the role of miracles, how we approach miracles. But I think the big thing for me is that we develop the grit and the perseverance and the trust to do what the families in the film did, to fight until the very end and not to give up. I think a lot of times, we give up too soon on seeking the miracle. And in the midst of giving up, we fail to see and understand what God might be trying to teach us and show us along the way in the process of suffering. Again, going back to Mark 5, the woman bleeding and struggling for 12 years, giving up all her money and still believing and reaching out to touch Jesus, and getting that healing when she can just touch his clothing. I think if we had that level of desperation in our faith lives, I can't imagine the things we could do collectively as a church in this world. So that's my hope, that we get closer to that.
And before we got into the interview, we had talked about that this isn't just a single film. This is actually a trilogy. The first film obviously focuses on miracles. Where are you going to take us in films 2 and 3?
So in film number 2, we are diving into angels and demons. And we're going to take the very same approach to stories and claims of the angelic and the demonic realm. And so we are actively engaged in working on that project right now. And then we hope to look later on as well, if we are blessed enough to be able to do the third, at heaven and hell. And so we're tackling increasingly, I feel like, difficult topics as time goes on.
And in terms of ETA for film 2, which is probably a little up in the air, and where do we go to find out more? Give us all the details.
Sure. cbn.com/supernatural for our miracles documentary. And we're looking right now tentatively at next year. So I would assume early to mid next year, 2026, which feels so far away, but we'll blink and we'll be there. So that's what we're looking at for the next film.
And for the folks who want to go even deeper into all things Billy Hallowell, where do we find you on the web?
Sure, you can go to billyhallowell.com. I'd also encourage people to head over to the CBN News, Christian Broadcasting Network News YouTube channel. We have content daily there that deals with some of these topics, deals with the news, and so much more. And we're programming there constantly. So there's throughout the day, tons of videos and news reports to check out.
And we'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have links in the description in the show notes to where you can check out this film, links to where you can connect with Billy. I'll even link to some of his books as well, just so you can see not only is he a good news guy and filmmaker, he's also a good writer. So we'll have that all linked up for you right there. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Billy Hallowell. Once again, the film we talked about today, investigating the supernatural miracles. And Billy, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's always an honor and a pleasure to have you back in the show.
Thanks for having me.